Hello and welcome again to Not Fake News. I was on this site Mediaite and I like to frequent often, and I check it out. It has interesting stories. It's a clean site. I like the layout. It's easy to watch. But then I noticed this today. Mediaite is a news and opinion blog covering politics and entertainment in the media industry. It is a flagship blog of Abrium Media, a ring of blogs run by ABC legal analyst Dan Abrams. And then it goes on and on with Gossip Cop also, and the Washington Post, the Huffington Post. Do these make any ring any bells? So I take what I get from this site now with a grain of salt. That being said, Andrew Sullivan questions Trump's mental stability. He refuses to recognize reality. Okay.
Is that this is a national emergency. You use the word emergency in your column. Why? What's your case?
Because any liberal democracy, any constitutional democracy, relies upon something we call the objective truth. Now, some politicians fear than lie. In fact, almost all of them do to some extent. But they always do it in a way that pays some sort of deference to reality. And what we've discovered is that in the last 3 weeks, this president, rather like he did on the campaign trail, simply insists that black is white, that things that we can see with our own eyes, like the size of his inauguration crowd, are not exactly what we're seeing. And he's able to command his underlings to actually go out there and also say things that are empirically untrue. This is not about politics or ideology. Like, there are some things that Trump believes in, for example, a more restrained America around the world, immigration controls, for example, that I'm sympathetic to. It's about the ability for the president to tell the truth and for us to believe it. And to have such an unstable figure, incapable of accepting reality at the center of the world, is an extremely dangerous thing.
You said unstable. In your column, you said mentally unstable. Why do you think it's appropriate to be describing the president that way?
I'm not a shrink, and if I were, I wouldn't say this anyway, because you can't diagnose someone. But I'm a human being, and I can tell if someone is saying things that we know not to be true and never corrects it. For example, that the murder rate, which is a very solid statistic, there are dead bodies we can count. When he says the murder rate is the highest it's been in 45 to 47 years, what are we supposed to do, Brian? Well, what is anybody supposed to do? This is simply completely bonkers.
What he means when he says that is the murder rate. It's really, really, really bad. And what are you supposed to do about his, lack of long words? Nothing. You have to agree. It's really bad.
He's saying things that do not exist. When a president is saying things like that and doesn't correct himself, has no one we have fact checkers now every day of the week compiling lists and lists and lists of things he's saying that are empirically untrue. Tell me that.
Whoops, sorry. Shit.
I would ask, knows they're false? But if he doesn't completely bonkers.
Okay.
He said...
Yeah, they have fact checkers? Really? Fact checkers? Maybe they should take those same fact checkers and put them on take them from looking at what Trump is doing and factually saying, and then just put it on your end and fact check your stories and your mind and everything that's coming out of your pie hole.
Saying things that do not exist. When a president is saying things like that and doesn't correct himself, has no one we have fact checkers now every day of the week compiling lists and lists and lists of things he's saying that are empirically untrue, false. Now, I don't know whether he knows they're false, but if he doesn't know they're false, then he needs to be informed. Right. If he knows they're false and still saying it's true, and if he doesn't know, then he shouldn't be in that office.
On the point about the murder rate, I remember the day he made that false statement this week. I talked with my editors at CNN, the head of standards at CNN. We reached the conclusion that specifically was a lie, and called it a lie because it's been corrected so many times, debunked so many times, and by now he must know the truth about the murder rate. But you're taking it a couple steps further by questioning his mental stability. And I wonder why you think that's not being said more often on television or in columns like your own. Do you feel like you were a bit alone on this issue? And if so, why?
Well, I think others are picking up on it. Certainly, if you're not on camera or not writing, people are talking about this all the time. I think sometimes you want to assume that there is a rationality at the center of our entire republic, that there is someone who can listen
Trying to make
reason,
it bigger for you.
who can see an empirical fact, who can distinguish between an opinion and a fact, between what he wants to be true and what is true. And sometimes we don't want to say that in public. We can't. But look, we're journalists, and we're trying to understand what's happening. And if
Yeah, the entire theme of this site is a little. It's a little left of center. If that makes any, if you know. So, like, did Kellyanne Conway just throw shade at Sean Spicer? They're a little, they're left of center. They're getting left over here. But okay, but it's good to know the other side story as well, right? But I don't know if it's worth listening to 9 minutes worth, but let's go a little more.
we don't just simply say what's in front of our eyes, what use are we? I mean, how are we supposed to do this when someone keeps telling us untruths every day?
Are you describing a failure of journalism?
I know. I wish someone would tell me how and what do we do when people keep lying to us all day, every day. People just like you, dude. God, that's such a hypocritical thing to say. Wow.
Journalism, you think, that it's not being addressed more publicly?
Well, I think journalists have been doing a fantastic job in many ways of fact-checking. But fact-checking doesn't really capture the extent of what's going on.
Are you serious?
And I think many journalists, for good reasons, because we don't want to say something's not right here,
Oh, of course. I
have
will.
to conform to certain routines and procedures and norms that we used to use. And, you know, all politicians, they say, fib. They pass the truth. Phil Clinton was someone who seemed to fib all the time. But they always paid some reference to reality. And when it was pointed out, when a fact was pointed out, they would correct it. He won't correct anything. In fact, I don't think of all the hundreds and hundreds of false statements he's made, he and his spokesman have not actually retracted a single one. And you ask yourself, why?
They might point to birtherism and say Trump did come out before Election Day and say President Obama was born in the U.S. That's the only example that comes to my mind of a statement that he corrected.
That's true, Brian. Only, as you saw, if you saw that press conference.
Okay. Now, I'm not saying it's not true. But I'm just saying I've been watching for a long time. And I do not remember Trump ever coming out and going, yeah, Obama's birth certificate is real and he was born in the USA. I think that was right there one of their talking points on their little list that they had to throw in. But I could be wrong. Trump could have said it, and I'd be very surprised. I'd love to see that.
It was incredibly reluctant, rushed, and then immediately followed by another attack.
Do you worry, though, that talking about this, about his psychology, you calling him mentally unstable and delusional, do you worry that it further causes divisions in the country, makes it impossible for the people who voted for him to want to hear you out?
And you know, one day a black ops just throws a bag over your head.
Of course I do. And God knows, I wish I weren't here having to say this. No one wants to be here saying this. I don't want to believe the President of the United States is just delusional or cannot accept reality. Of course not. It pains me. It gives me great pain and concern and distress. But at some point, being a writer or a journalist requires one to simply say what one is seeing in front of one's eyes. And sometimes you have to say that in plain English.
So you don't see any alternative explanations for his behavior?
Well, I do think that his ego is involved. I do think that he wants not to seem as if he's gotten something wrong. He does want to say things that advance certain policies that he wants to propose, all of which is fine. All of which is... But what I'm saying is if you continually do that and you never recognize reality, if you're still insisting, as he was as lately as last Friday, that there was massive voter fraud.
This is so insane that we're watching this whole thing, no matter what.
That millions of people voted, all of whom voted for Hillary.
It just got good, in my opinion. I mean, this. I have so much to say about this. It's crazy.
Clinton didn't vote for him, were voting in the last election. That is simply, first of all, completely untrue. It's also deeply destructive of democratic legitimacy. And it is, to put it frankly, a little bonkers.
There's been a strain of reaction in television and in conservative media circles that all this media coverage of Trump, all this criticism of Trump, people suggesting he's unstable, it's all hysteria. Take a look at this compilation from Fox News.
You read these hysterical headlines in the media. You got the mainstream media beating him up. I thought there was a lot of media hysteria over the Trump executive order on the refugees.
You know, more of the same kind of hysterical hand-wringing that seems now to go on about everything that Donald Trump ever says.
He's opposed by the mainstream media.
Andrew, you calling this an emergency is going to have them saying you're being hysterical. Your reaction?
Yeah, sure. Say that. I mean, I'm happy to be called hysterical if people want to call me that. I would ask them instead, how do you explain the constant barrage of untruths, falsehoods, and lies coming out of this person? How do you explain that? And when you talk about hysteria, I'm not tweeting in the early hours of the morning in all caps. I'm not out of control in terms of tweeting every morning, noon, and night about things that are not true, violating established norms of responsible behavior in the office of the president. If there is anybody who's actually exhibiting hysteria, panic, out of controlness, it's coming from the Oval Office, not from the rest of us. Liberal democracy requires some consensus, some common facts, some common reality for us to have a really good fight over. Like we should have bare knuckles fight ideologically, politically, and everything, but we have to relate it to reality at some point, our interpretation of reality. And when the central figure in our political system is creating an entire world of unreality, how are we supposed to respond? And I think we have to respond. We have to respond by saying, excuse me, Mr. President, with all due respect, you keep telling us things that are not true. Can you please stop this? And if you can't stop it, if you simply keep asserting the world is one way when it really isn't, because everybody else can see it, then we have a serious problem at the very heart of our government. And denying that, or tiptoeing around it, or not saying it plainly, is a failure of our duty as journalists, as writers, as reporters, to say and call it as we see it.
Andrew Sullivan, thank you so much for being here this morning.
You're so welcome, Brian.
Broadway's next must-see musical takes you into the heart of the remarkable true story of 7,000 stranded passengers and a small town in Newfoundland that welcomed them. Come From Away, arriving from a record-breaking journey where it was hailed as best of the year across North America. Come From Away welcomes you to a powerful celebration of humanity. Go see this gem of a musical. Because we come from everywhere, we all come from away.
Fraud as well. President Trump again this week suggested in a meeting with senators that thousands of illegal voters were bused from Massachusetts to New Hampshire, and that's what caused his defeat in the state of New Hampshire, also the defeat of Senator Kelly Ayotte. That has provoked a response from a member of the Federal Election Commission, Ellen Weintraub, who says, I call upon the president to immediately share New Hampshire voter fraud evidence so that his allegations may be investigated promptly. Do you have that evidence?
I've actually, having worked before on a campaign in New Hampshire, I can tell you that this issue of busing voters into New Hampshire is widely known by anyone who's worked in New Hampshire politics. It's very real. It's very serious. This morning on this show is not the venue for me to lay out all the evidence, but I can tell you this. Voter fraud is a serious problem in this country. You have millions of people who are registered in 2 states or who are dead who are registered to vote, and you have 14% of non-citizens, according to academic research, at a minimum, are registered to vote, which is an astonishing statistic.
You can't hold on a second. You just claimed again that there was illegal voting in New Hampshire, people busting from the state of Massachusetts. Do you have evidence
I'm saying
to back that up?
anybody, George, go to New Hampshire, talk to anybody who's worked in politics there for a long time. Everybody's aware of the problem in New Hampshire with respect to
I'm asking you as the White House senior
hold
on a second. I'm asking you as the White House senior policy advisor. The president made a statement saying he was the victim of voter fraud. People
and the
being bused from Massachusetts
the
and New
president
Hampshire.
was.
Do you have any evidence?
If this is an issue that interests you, then we could talk about it more in the future. And we now have our governance beginning to get stood up, but we have the Department of Justice, and we have more officials. And the issue of voter fraud is something we're going to be looking at very seriously and very hard. But the reality is that we know for a fact you have massive numbers of non-citizens registered to vote in this country. Nobody disputes that. And many highly qualified people, like Chris Kobach, the Kansas Secretary of State, have looked deeply into this issue and have confirmed it to be true and have put together evidence. And I suggest you invite Chris Kobach onto your show, and he can walk you through some of the evidence of voter fraud in greater detail.
Just for the record, you have provided absolutely no evidence. The president has made a statement.
The White House has provided enormous evidence with respect to voter fraud, with respect to people being registered in more than one state, dead people voting, non-citizens being registered to vote. George, it is a fact, and you will not deny it, that there are massive numbers of non-citizens in this country who are registered to vote. That is a scandal. We should stop the presses, and as a country, we should be aghast about the fact that you have people who have no right to vote in this country, registered to vote, canceling out the franchise of lawful citizens of this country. That's the story we should be talking about, and I'm prepared to go on any show, anywhere, anytime, and repeat it and say the President of the United States is correct 100%.
You just repeated that. You just made those declarations, but for the record, you have provided zero evidence that the president was the victim of massive voter fraud in New Hampshire. You have provided zero evidence.
Anyone who's worked in New Hampshire politics is familiar with that.
You have provided zero evidence that the president's claimed that he would have won the popular. If 3 to 5 million illegal immigrants hadn't voted, zero evidence for either one of those claims.
Well, it's
Thanks a lot for joining us this morning.
The non-citizen voting issue is pervasive and widespread, and we are going to protect our country from voter fraud. We're going to protect our borders from terrorism, and we're going to protect innocent men, women, and children from violent, criminal, illegal immigrants that need to be removed from this country. And our country will create jobs, safety, prosperity, and security, particularly for disenfranchised working people of every background, faith, and ethnicity in this country.
You can start by providing evidence to back up your claims. Thanks for joining.
Ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer. Ambassador Dermer, thank you for taking the time today.
Good to be with you.
Certainly momentous events. I want to begin. You've obviously been repeatedly extremely critical of the Obama administration for abstaining from this vote. But aside from this disagreement, I want to ask, what evidence do you have that the Obama administration has been biased against Israel, anti-Israel?
Well, up until this point, at the United Nations, they actually vetoed a Security Council resolution against Israel. In fact, the only veto that they did during their presidency, which we were deeply appreciative of. But this resolution itself is a resolution that effectively will call for boycotts and sanctions against Israel. That's the language of the resolution, to ask states in their relevant dealings with Israel to make the distinction between pre-67 Israel and Israel beyond the 1967 lines. What does that mean? People will use this resolution to stir the pot for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, and to bring Israeli soldiers and maybe even Israeli citizens to the International Criminal Court. So they shouldn't have vetoed this because their policy, as they've stated so many times, is to stand firmly against the delegitimization of Israel. But what they did was back a UN Security Council resolution that delegitimizes Israel.
But why shouldn't, to be clear, it does not delegitimize Israel? This takes issue purely with settlements.
No, it doesn't.
Outside.
It doesn't. Read the resolution put up.
I've read it many times, and it draws attention specifically to settlement activity, in addition to Palestinian support for terror.
It also says, Jim, that there can be no change in the status of the territories beyond the 1967 lines without the Palestinians agreeing to it. That's new. That's shifting the goalposts in the negotiations. And we're having a conversation about Israeli settlements. I just heard a speech from Secretary Kerry of 72 minutes where he spent a good chunk of that speech talking about settlements. He went after the Israeli government, the Israeli coalition, the extreme right politics. People have to understand, right now the path of the Palestinian government is comprised of Hamas. They're a terror organization that openly calls for the murder of Jews worldwide.
No question.
I did not hear Secretary Kerry say that.
You referenced the resolution. I just want to quote from the resolution because in addition to calling on Israel to stop building settlements, the resolution also calls on Palestinians for immediate steps to prevent all acts of violence against civilians. But on the issue of settlements, what nation in the world, other than Israel, believes that settlements are acceptable?
It doesn't matter that all the
It
nations
does matter.
in the world
No, I'm asking for one nation. Can you name one nation?
No, but the whole world gangs up against Israel. Like I said, it's a very old story. We have a dispute with the Palestinians of that territory. We are not for it.
But the reason it's an old story is because international law since 1967 has declared settlements illegal. I mean, in fact, even Israeli law calls some of those illegal outposts illegal.
The way it works in international law, and I don't know if during this show we can get into all the intricacies of it, but there was no sovereign when it came into possession of these territories, which are not foreign territories where we're coming in as foreign colonialists like the Belgians in Congo or the French in Algeria or the British in India. This is the historic homeland of the Jewish people. This is the territory called Judea. You know why Jews are called Jews? Because we are the people from Judea. So now the whole world will say that the Jews are occupiers in Judea. The whole world says that the Jews...
It sounds like you're making a case there against the two states.
The whole world is saying that the Jews are occupiers in Jerusalem. So because the whole world says it, that makes it right?
Well, the resolution specified East Jerusalem, and it's not the first resolution to cite Jerusalem. Just for a moment, it's not the first resolution to cite Jerusalem as part of the occupied territories going back. I mean, Ronald Reagan abstained from a resolution in 1987 that included Jerusalem in the occupied territories. And numerous UN resolutions have included Jerusalem. This one actually specifies East Jerusalem as opposed to Jerusalem as a whole.
Yeah, but Jerusalem that you're talking about, East Jerusalem, just so your viewers understand, that's the old city of Jerusalem. That's the Jewish quarter. That's the Western Wall. So if the whole world...
There's also a number... I've been to Jerusalem many times. There are many Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem and have for hundreds of years and generations.
If the whole world says that the Western Wall is occupied Palestinian territory, does that make it occupied Palestinian territory? It's absurd. We have a conflict with the Palestinians. We have to resolve that conflict through negotiations. We have a territory in dispute. What this UN Security Council resolution did is it basically ceded that territory to the Palestinians. It says it's yours. It's occupied Palestinian territory. So let me ask you a question. Why would the Palestinians negotiate with us if all of a sudden the world is saying all of that territory is yours?
Well, in fact, there's a statement today. I'll read you a statement today from Saab Erekat from the Palestinian Liberation Organization. You know him well. The minute the Israeli government agrees to cease all settlement activities, including in and around the occupied East Jerusalem, and agree to implement signed agreements, the Palestinian leadership stands ready to resume permanent status negotiations.
Yeah, well, the minute Israel said...
Do you accept that as...
Well, the minute Israel said the Western Wall is occupied Palestinian territory, they'll agree to sit down with us and negotiate. Look, have to understand, this administration has been obsessed with the issue of settlements since day one. This is not new. Kerry spoke about all these things that have happened, the Israeli coalition, laws that were passed in the Israeli Knesset. I'm old enough to remember what happened in 2009. In the first months of this administration, they had a crisis with us on the issue of settlements, which was not a crisis going in. We had reached understandings with the Bush administration of where to build and where not to build. This has been from day one a policy of this administration. I remember when President Obama was in China. Wait, let me just give these facts to the public. President Obama was in China during his first year in office, and I was sitting in the Israeli Prime Minister's office, and I heard that President Obama had strongly condemned Israel, strongly condemned, language that is usually used for mass murder. He had strongly condemned Israel for building apartments in Jerusalem, in a neighborhood in Jerusalem.
Let me come back here for a moment,
knows
because
part of a peace agreement.
These are familiar points. For our viewers who don't know the situation well, I want to put up a map of Israeli occupations in the West Bank. First of all, here's the map of the occupations. The West Bank there, of course, on the right-hand side. And then if we could show the next graph, how the number of settlers in those occupied territories have grown, particularly during the Netanyahu administration. Let me just ask you this in the simplest terms. Why is that necessary?
Look, understand. We have a dispute with the Palestinians.
I understand, but
they have. You should put up a graph. Here's the graph that I'd like to see.
But internationally, the West Bank is not disputed. That is, it's outside the 67 borders.
It is disputed. But it is disputed.
But just answer the question even from a security perspective. Why do those settlements help?
Why do those settlements help? Advancing peace?
Help? Well,
so you're
advancing peace or even Israeli security.
So basically the argument says that if we have Jews living in their historic homeland, that is an obstacle to advancing a two-state solution. You know what's an obstacle to advancing a two-state solution?
As you know, many of the settlements are built on land owned by Palestinians.
A Palestinian,
right?
no, it's public land. Whenever you have people on private land, the Supreme Court prevents that. What prevents peace is a Palestinian authority that incites an entire generation of young Palestinians to hate Jews, that glorifies mass murderers, and says, we don't want any Jews to live in this territory, period. What I'd like to hear from Saeb Erekat is say, you know what? Just as Israel has 20% of its population...
Palestinians have talked about land swaps.
I want to finish
existing settlements. No, but just on that point, because you're saying many things at once, Palestinian negotiators have accepted as part of a final peace agreement, accepting some existing settlements in the West Bank in exchange for land, as you know better than me. You know, the trouble is those settlements have grown, multiplied, not exponentially, they've multiplied during that time period. I just want to move on to this.
No, if you actually look at the footprint, it hasn't changed much in the last 8 years.
I've visited those settlements. I've seen them grow.
There's no question that if we have a Palestinian partner who wants to make peace with us, we can. But the point that I want to finish, which is very important.
But on the two-state solution, that's a key point.
Whatever you ask me, I'm going to finish this point because it needs to
go ahead, and I will ask you about
because we had a Secretary of State for 72 minutes blame Israel for the lack of peace. We need a Palestinian leadership that will say that they are willing to live with Jews among them and next to a Jewish state. That has not been said. That's what this conflict has been about.
To accept the right of Israel to exist, you're saying.
To accept that there will be a nation state of the Jewish people next to them. And the way that they would show that is by showing, all these people who live in this territory, they're Jews, and just like Israel has Muslims, and just like Israel has Christians, by the way, the only Christians that are protected in the entire Middle East is they're literally running for their lives. Just as Israel has Muslims and non-Jews in their territory, full rights, we would give Jews who live in our territory full rights, but they never say that because they want that land ethnically cleansed of Jews.
I just want to make that point here because you know this, again, better than me, but I've visited Israel many times, and there are many Israelis who oppose the expansion of the settlements, not just because of the effects on peace, prospects for a two-state solution, but also because of the danger to Israeli defense forces who are required to defend them. They don't want to send their sons and daughters to defend them. There are opposition, there is strong, as you know, opposition to settlements among Israelis.
Yes, there is, and because we're a democracy.
Sure.
And we always have opposition. But you know what? The Prime Minister of Israel has been elected multiple times. He leads a government that represents the views of the Israeli people. And as the Prime Minister said today, our future will be determined not by speeches in Washington, not by votes at the United Nations, not by conferences in Paris, but by the people of Israel who, by the way, want peace more than anyone else. We want it as much as the Secretary of State of the United States, with all due respect for him.
But
I have five children. I don't want to see 4 of my sons have to serve in the Israeli army and fight and die. So many Israelis had to make huge sacrifices for peace. We want peace more than anyone, but we need a partner who's willing to live in peace with us and end the conflict once and for all. And instead of pressuring Israel and blaming Israel for the lack of peace, start telling the Palestinians you have to end this glorification of mass murderer. You have to take a stance internally within your societies to end this incitement against Israel and to teach your children that you want to live ultimately in peace.
Just a final question. You want peace, and I know you're very close to the Prime Minister Netanyahu, peace via two-state solution, because the Prime Minister said in March 2015 that a Palestinian nation would never be formed while he's Prime Minister.
That's actually not what he said. What he said was
he was asked while he's Prime Minister, would a Palestinian state never be formed? Indeed, he said it would simply, and I'm quoting from him here, simply be giving a base for attacks to the radical attacks by radical Islam against Israel.
The Prime Minister, the Prime Minister before his election gave about 50 interviews. And my Prime Minister, if there's one thing he knows how to do, is deliver a message. And if that's the message that he wanted to deliver to the Israeli voters, he would have done it in.
So he would support a two-state.
The Prime Minister would support it, and he said it just recently on 60 Minutes. He said it after your elections here. He'll sell it. He'll say it moving forward. He supports a solution of two states for two peoples, where a demilitarized Palestinian state recognizes the Jewish state of Israel. That is the policy of the Prime Minister of Israel.
Ambassador Dermot, thank you for coming into the Situation Room. We appreciate it. Thanks for your honest answers.
Thank you.
The Quentin cult, if you will, is like 23 years old, starting with Reservoir Dogs, right? And that was, he's sort of the guy who introduced the idea of violence as attitude, violence as fashion, violence as style. You know, it wasn't exactly dealt with in an earnest, this is a real way. It's,
right.
You know, swagger thing.
Yeah.
I was just looking in the New York Times this morning, and then the guy interviewed many people from the Midwest and from the West about San Bernardino.
Mm-hmm.
And the basic conclusion is that there's everybody out there has this feeling of anxiety about when's the next one. Go mine.
Who's talking right now?
How are you going to connect the dots for me?
I think that there's a feeling about shootings and violence. It's different now